Dear colleagues, dear organizing committee, thank you very much for organizing a virtual conference and not canceling it completely as many other conferences have done. It's really nice to have this possibility to present our results. Quite new for us, and it's quite new for us to make a collaborate work. So we will present our findings about other story of collaboration from the 19th century, and we will reconstruct for you a network developed by one of the most famous Russian writers, Ivan Turgenev. I will call it in Russian pronunciation, not Ivan. I hope you'll appreciate this tone of Russian language in our presentation. We are two authors of this presentation, Olga Kruglikova and me, Anna Sergeyevna Smoliarova from St. Petersburg State University. I will make a short introduction into our study, and then Olga Sergeyevna will give you more details about our findings. And we decided that I will say next slide, because Olga Sergeyevna is responsible for presentation, to remain a piece of normal life when we told our colleagues to will help us with the presentation. So please, next slide, and we will start with our findings. First, I have to mention that social network analysis, as well as digital humanities, developed lots of studies about networks within novels and plays and other creative works. They focused on characters and also created models, for example, how plot develops within a play or a novel. And these kinds of models allow researchers comparing, for example, Shakespearean works with Chekhov's works, and make some comparison between styles and plots, as well as sometimes revealing authors of texts that were unauthorized, or proving that another person is an author of the particular text. But networks of creators are less developed within digital humanities and social network analysis. Networks of characters are much more present in such kind of studies. Still, there are research applications dedicated to networks of different arts, painters, writers, musicians, and so on. These studies revealed the collective nature of art creation. They have shown that many works were influenced by social ties and collaboration of artists, and they also have shown that very often people we know from textbooks got their place in the textbook because they had a very good network. Like Picasso or other avant-garde artists and painters, for example, those who belong to the first range artists are in the center of a network, and social network analysis has shown that they can be measured in terms of between centrality or PageRank centrality that we could adjust from modern social media analysis, for example. So, for example, network analysis supports the findings that network organization is connected to be a star, to becoming a star in creative world. Considering networks of creators, different arts and periods were studied, from musics and composers to poets and even museums and painters. Still, there are some probably most important works were dedicated to classical works, to philosophers, and very famous writers. And I will show you two examples of works I find quite prominent. Next slide will show the famous work of Collins. It's translated into Russian and I recommend it. He reconstructed the connections between generations of philosophers from ancient China and ancient Greek. And Collins has shown how quotations can be seen as a network. And another example of a prominent work, next slide, please. There was a project called Global Literary Networks. It still explores mostly national contexts. For example, they constructed a network of American poets and writers. And in this case, it's not just a visualization like made by Collins, but a Gephi construction of a graph with edges and nodes that you can measure in terms of social network analysis. So we see that the field develops quite actively. But when we talk about networks of creators, very often we don't have enough big data to make a real graph with measurements. And in our case, we will show you some visualizations of smaller network, not in terms of its importance, but in terms of data we can generate from this correspondence and network. Next slide, please. So in our study, we focus on one particular research question about transnational transfer of ideas and collaborations. Usually, studies with social network approach in digital humanities are made in national frameworks. But it's obvious that if the transnational transfer had place, it's not enough to explain why this work, this novel looks like we can read nowadays, only by the national framework, by the national context. And we focus on interactions between agents in Europe, between Russian Empire and European countries. And we would like to reconstruct the network of Ivan Turgenev. So Ivan Turgenev was one of the most famous Russian writers of the 19th century and also very prominent in the European literature and European networks of writers. And to our knowledge, he developed the broadest network of correspondence. In Russian science, his works are mostly studied in terms of his writings, his journalistic activities, and of course political positions, mostly in Soviet times, for example. But Turgenev as transnational mediator remains understudied. With very few exceptions, we can mention only the work written by Alexeyev about Turgenev as propagandist of Russian literature to the Western countries. But his correspondence shows that he was very, very active and he was exactly in the middle of the broad network of connections between several European countries with other prominent writers of that time. And now I will very briefly describe his correspondence just in general to make you a bit familiar with it. And then Olga Sergeyevna will follow me and give you all the details about Turgenev's network. First of all, imagine that he wrote and sent from 3 to 7 letters every day. It's almost a contemporary intensity of mailing, not emailing, but mailing. And actually, the incoming correspondence was even more intense because he apologizes always in his letters for answering late and not answering immediately. So you can find, a soulmate in Turgenev's correspondence. And his writings in letters is almost contemporary. It's not some kind of romantic narrative with paragraphs of 10 to 15 sentences. He writes a paragraph by paragraph with some questions in each of them, and he combined this serious and informal style with jokes and quite direct answering questions that is also familiar for us from messengers and our daily correspondence. And if we have to get a formula from all his correspondence, we have to formulate it as 4R and 1O. He answered, he recommends journalists to the publishers. He recommends journalists in which platform is better for their works, and also writers, not only journalists, but also writers. He reviews manuscripts sent to him for comments. He recommends already published works to his friends, like reposting them on Facebook. And he also organized a lot of events, philanthropic events, for example, free reading rooms. And a significant share of his correspondence is related to this pragmatic stuff, event management, and so on. So that's in general his correspondence. And now we are going into details and tell you about whom he wrote and who belonged to his network. So my next slide and my last slide from me, 5 groups of Turgenev's correspondence. He advised beginners in writing, including Russian immigrants and also quite interesting female writers in Russia. He conducted lots of correspondence with Russian publishers and contributors, well, magazine world, so to say, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He promotes foreign writers for the Russian audience, and vice versa. He promotes well-established Russian writers for foreign public. And finally, he had lots of correspondence with representatives of Russian diaspora abroad in Europe. So I give the floor to Olga Sergeyevna. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you, Anna Sergeyevna, and dear colleagues, I would like first of all to point out one important idea, that Turgenev was the first Russian writer who gained the international recognition. Translation of his works are readily published by European newspapers and magazines. The steadily growing popularity of Turgenev's work in the West was led to the fact that over the years, the leading figures of European literary criticism, like Hippolyte Taine or Ernst Renan, unconditionally placed him among the first writers of Europe. Extensive correspondence with his friend Toropov contains various instructions of Turgenev to ensure that he gets acquainted with Russian newspapers and news. The writer demanded to receive the newspaper Voice, one of the most important Russian newspapers of the time, but here at the same time he was worried to have some kind of ideological counterbalance, and to be he wanted to be subscribed with the different newspapers and journals with different socio-political positions. It was very important for him to feel himself already part of Russian culture, of Russian political and social process, in spite of the fact that he was living in France for a very long period of his life. And let's see this slide, how many newspapers and journals from Russia he was subscribed and read almost every day. From this picture, we could understand that he really was a part of Russian society. of that time. He had a different and very multi-level picture of Russian social process of that time. But with some newspapers and some journals, he was not only a reader, but a kind of mediator, maybe a part of editorial board. Turgenev has had a significant impact on the editors of the journal Vestnik Evropy, the Herald of Europe. The editor of Vestnik Evropy, Mikhail Stasilevich, registered all manuscripts submitted to the journal. And we as the researchers should be very thankful to Mikhail Stasilevich for having this very important data for our research. He recorded all the information about the received works, the reasons for accepting or rejecting manuscripts, and all the works received through the mediation and recommendation of Turgenev were marked specially, and this group made up a significant part of the entire editorial portfolio. Stasilevich didn't follow all the recommendation of Turgenev unconditionally, of course. The most common reason for refusal was the censorship. Stasilevich was more familiar with Russian censorship realities and considered some works suggested by Turgenev as too risky to publish in Russia. For example, the conflict around censorship restriction was especially acute in the case of Flaubert's sharp anti-clerical novel, The Temptation of Saint Anthony. Turgenev insisted on its publication, although he understood the difficulties. Turgenev asked Stasilevich in his letters to find a first-class translator who wouldn't only ensure a high-quality transfer of the artistic merits of Flaubert's texts, but would also be able to cleverly bypass difficult places, as it was written in Turgenev's letter. On behalf of Flaubert, Turgenev promised his consent to adjust and soften some schemes of the novel for a Russian translator. But unfortunately, in fact, they didn't need a translator, because after reading the novel in French, Stasilevich categorically refused to publish it, explaining that only those who had previously left for Paris could decide to print this novel in Russia. And this publication didn't take place in Russia at that time. In extremely rare cases, publishers refused to follow Turgenev's recommendation because of discrepancy in the evaluation of the artistic qualities of the work. First, this happened with some works of female writers promoted by Turgenev. If the manuscript seemed worth to be supported, Turgenev recommended it to the other journals. In some cases, he warmly supported the author. In others, he limited himself to a neutral recommendation of a friend, or directly denied responsibility for the text's quality. For the magazines, this cooperation, which took place not only with Vestnik Evropy, but, for example, if Vestnik Evropy refused to publish some manuscripts, Turgenev tried to give it to the other publishers, like the journal Pchela, journal Slover, and newspaper Порядок. And for all magazines, cooperation with Turgenev was mutually beneficial, since through the mediation of Turgenev, the magazine received not only the manuscripts of secondary importance of the novice authors, but also masterpieces of European stars for the first for the first line, so I could say maybe. It takes us to the next point, to the next group of Turgenev's correspondence. It's foreign writers promoted by Turgenev for a Russian audience. Let's look at this slide, and we'll try to show you how difficult this network was, how multi-level it was. The most ambitious is Turgenev's work to familiarize the Russian public with the talent of Emile Zola. It is curious that Turgenev aimed to introduce Zola to the Russian public not only as a novelist, but maybe first of all as a journalist. In January 1875, when Zola's novel, one of Zola's novel by Turgenev's efforts was already published in the magazine, Turgenev wrote to Stasilevich, the editor of Vestnik Evropy, would you like to receive the Paris reviews from Zola without his signature? He would do it smartly and efficiently. Sure, you already have a Paris correspondent, but Zola could pay attention mainly to literary, artistic, social phenomena, and Turgenev promised that Zola would avoid to tell about politics in his reviews, because political articles Vestnik Evropy has already received from another important person of European journalism, August Nefzer. This interaction between Turgenev, Zola, and Stasilevich took place. It was rather successful. Turgenev, after receiving Stasilevich's prior consent to get acquainted with Zola's trial peloton, forwards him a text that he calls a little masterpiece, and emphasized once again, it seems to me that if you have another correspondent from Paris, it's impossible to damage both, because Zola will not talk about politics, but about literature, art, and other pleasant things. Therefore, this publication took place in Vestnik Evropy, and after that, we should mention that Turgenev tried to get acquainted with Zola's masterpieces, not only Russian readers, but as well readers in Austria, and therefore here had a lot of collaboration with the editor of Vienna Zeitung. And it was another interesting point of this network. Through Turgenev's efforts, an agreement between Zola and the magazine was concluded, and the page of the Vestnik Evropy was periodically appeared Paris letters written by Zola. It's one of interesting fact about this collaboration that Turgenev showed a keen participation in the financial questions, and even paid the last first fee on behalf of Vestnik Evropy from his own funds, without waiting for the money to be sent from the publisher, because Zola needed money, and he was in very difficult circumstances at the time. A few months later, in April of the same year, Turgenev wrote to Stasilevich about his next idea. Well, Zola and now Taine is picking. He writes a large essay in 3 parts, in which he proposes to present the foundation on which modern time is based. If you want to perform the same operation with him as with Zola's novel, then he agreed to send you the manuscript, 10 is not a revolutionary, and it will be much easier to translate him. But he would like to get higher price. I'm still happy and ready to serve as a mediator. The French publisher of 10 strongly opposed this cooperation, as he saw it as an oppression of his commercial rights. We would like to remind that educated Russians often bought books from abroad and read them without translation, since most of them were fluent in European languages. Despite this project was failed, Turgenev expressed his readiness to continue to serve as a mediator. Through his agency, Vestnik Европы published a number of works by Victor Hugo and Gustave Flaubert. Later, another newspaper run by Stasilevich, it was newspaper Порядок, began to publish the correspondence on the problems of domestic and foreign policy of England through Turgenev's mediation. British correspondent Edward Beasley, contrary to the last case, agreed to avoid talking about the cultural and literary life of England that was covered by Regnard on the page of Vestnik Европы. Unfortunately, not all Turgenev ideas were perceived positively by the Russian public. In 1880, Turgenev coordinated the entire organizational work of the Committee for the Construction of the Monument to Gustave Flaubert, headed by Victor Hugo. Turgenev hoped to contribute to the construction through a charity gathering among the Russian reading public. At his request, announcement of the collection of money was published in the Russian Ведомости, Вестник Европы, Новое Обозрение, and some other newspapers. However, the reaction of the Russian public was mostly negative and rather noisy. Turgenev was accused of neglected the interest of Russian literature in favor of Western, and sometimes even the desire to make a great deal of money from it. It was very strange for Turgenev, because here wasn't this reaction of Russian society was unpredictable for Turgenev. It's also interesting to note that Turgenev cared about the favorable attention to the works of his French friends, as I have already said, not only by Russian critics but also in Germany. And his correspondence with their German journalist and publisher Julian Schmidt indicates that he didn't disregard their assessment of their work in the German press. Turgenev sent to Schmidt their first novels from the series of Rougon-Macquart, and later notes that he plans to transfer Zola copies of the Vienna Zeitung with reviews on them. In the same letter, Turgenev proposed to send Schmidt a fresh novel of Gustave Flaubert, Education of Feelings, which was already met the negative response of French criticism. Turgenev is flirting with a German publisher. Recall that the case takes place shortly after the Franco-Prussian War. And Turgenev wrote, "In France, it failed. For the French, this truth turned out to be too bitter." As for their other part of Turgenev's activity in making this network, we already told about that fact that Turgenev tried to translate their most favorable Russian writers into European languages and supported their publishing of their works in European press. Turgenev was among those who first tried to make a French public familiar with the works of Gogol. In 1845, his short novels were translated by Louis Verdot and published in Paris. The French journalist didn't know a word in Russian, and he honestly admitted it in the preface to the collection, explaining that the Russian friends Turgenev and Gideonov helped him with this translation. The perception of this translation were different in Russia. For example, Belinsky, who didn't know a word in French, considered the translation is beautiful. Dostoevsky wrote that he foresaw in advance that Gogol couldn't be translated, but he didn't expect that the beauty of Gogol's work would evaporate completely without a trace. Still, this translation became a bridge for European readers as an acquaintance with Gogol, and not only for French public, because it is known that Charles Dickens became acquainted with this translation, and this allowed Gogol to discover English culture. At the same time, in 1840s, Turgenev is, in collaboration with Louis Verdot, translates their Captain Daughter and the Little Tragedies by Pushkin. Later, in 1863, the chapter from Evgeny Onegin, all verses were translated by prose. The French public met Pushkin generally coldly, as it met Gogol's work. It turned out to be impossible to interpret Pushkin outside the national context, and translators can hardly be blamed for this. In 1887s, Turgenev, with particular persistence, promoted work of Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Maybe it's better to say even Fyodor Dostoevsky, because they have a lot of personal misunderstanding in relations between two great writers, even hostility between them. But in spite of that fact, Turgenev tried to make Dostoevsky's work known in the West. He curated personal translations of Tolstoy's work, involving Verdot in this extensive work. And Turgenev dreamed to introducing works of Ostrovsky to European public, considering him a typically Russian writer. He not only recommends publishers to translate the play Thunderstorm into French, but also helps the translator. He assured Ostrovsky in one of his letters, "Here in a foreign land, everything Russian has become even closer and dearer to me, and none of our writers does the Russian spirit glow with such force as you." So we can see on this slide that the Turgenev's work for connecting with the propaganda of Russian literature in the West was really it was really a huge work, and I think it had a great results for intercultural relations of that time. It's interesting to mention that French publishers sent Turgenev for examination books related to Russia. For example, the publisher Etzel at the urgent demand of Jules Verne sends his novel about Russia, Michel Strogoff. He sends it to Turgenev, and Turgenev praised the style and the entertaining plot of this book, but pointed out the complete unplausibility of the description of Russia developed by Jules Verne. One important project of Turgenev was a project of Paris free reading rooms for Russian diaspora in France. It is interesting from different point of view, for example, mostly the readers of these reading rooms were revolutionary emigrants from Russia, and Turgenev wasn't ever interested in revolutionary way of development in Russia, but he supported, anyhow he supported this project. He supported this mostly very young men to make relationship with Russia, even in their circumstances when they ought to leave his native country and leave their other part of the world. This project is still working right now, and it is one of the greatest results of Turgenev's social networks working, I think. As for conclusions of our research, we'd like to point out three theses. Turgenev not only developed a network between Russia and France as his home and host countries, but established collaborations between France and Germany, Russia and Britain. It was a great collaboration between different nations. Turgenev influences processes in literature as well as in journalism. It is very important because about his activities in literature we know more or less, but his activities in journalism, in establishing intercultural relationship in journalism, we simply know nothing sometimes, because it's a field for further research, for future research, I think. We consider Turgenev's relation with his correspondence as anchor. Sorry, I think honestly, again, I think I need help with
ancestor. Well,
maybe yes.
Yeah. Prototype.
Okay. And a promise of contemporary networked communications. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your attention, and maybe during our further communication we could have a possibility to answer your questions, or maybe to collaborate with different research connecting with Turgenev networks, because looking at the program of this conference, we may find another research connecting with a different part of Turgenev's social networking, and I think it could be a great point for further collaboration in research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention, and see you online. Looking forward for our communication.